This morning we're going to be having a really practical chat about how you measure ROI when you're purchasing or investing in agritech. We've got Darren Price here, who's a bit of a stalwart in the ag innovation community and has worn a lot of different hats, but at the moment is heading up AgScent, and we'll talk a little bit about that tech and how we might look at how we measure and identify the points of value in different sorts of technology where often it's very new or not that easy to see. Did you want to provide any other background, Darren, on yourself before we cruise on through?
Thanks, Pip. So, Darren Price, I'm Chief Operating Officer at AgScent. My background is commercial agriculture, so I've been in commercial ag for 38 years. For a lot of that period of time, I worked on farms, in the management roles and so on and so forth. So had a lot of exposure to various types of tech over my career, particularly in the last 10 years. But now I'm working as the Chief Operating Officer with AgScent. We're a biotechnology company, and I've been involved with AgScent one way or the other for since 2018. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Darren. And so Riverine Plains, we're a farming systems group, which means we're largely tech scouts for our farmer members, and we've got over 430 farmer members that we're trying to provide information on, whether it's new practice changes or new digital technologies or inputs that we can actually increase the productivity of systems, the sustainability and resilience of their farm businesses. And so everything that we do is in a commercial context, but we also deliver a lot of research and development. So while we're looking at how we can help farm businesses, we're also trying to understand the new technologies that can help us do our jobs better in providing that information to our farmers. So return on investment, ROI, very simple, but let's actually define what we mean by agritech first. And so we have a lot of different types of agritech, and you can all look on the Oz Agritech website if you want to see hundreds and hundreds of agritech companies in a lot of different forms. There's a lot of emerging technologies, but the ones that we're using a lot of connectivity, farm management software, other software that gives us a system diagnostics. We're using a lot of sensors, and we're using a lot of inputs. There's a lot of new inputs coming in the market that's using new technologies. And we need to learn how to validate and also get them adopted by our farmers, which sometimes can be a lot harder. And so when we're thinking about who the customer is for agritech, we've got our farm businesses, and so you're looking at about $100 billion industry by the time you put fisheries and forestry in there. But Australian agribusiness is actually about $343 billion worth of business. And so think all your agribusiness bankers, there's thousands of business development and sales managers for hundreds of technology companies here at Henty Field Days. All of this stuff doesn't happen, and it's a massive, massive industry, agribusiness in Australia. And then we've got our global supply chain, and so we're up around $9 trillion US in terms of those other supply chain stakeholders that we're often investing in agritech to meet their needs or evolving market needs. And so very simply, we can get really caught up trying to do different analysis on agritech, but if you think of it in very simple terms, it either saves you time or creates more time, saves you money or makes you money. It decreases risk, especially if you're looking for farm safety or production risk. There's a lot of ROI to be had in actually avoiding the risks that can actually wipe out or make farming very difficult. And increases job satisfaction. So everyone wants to be able to do their job, do it well. And so often we're investing in technologies just to make our jobs easier, or because we like the technology. Sometimes it's hard to justify the value of it, but you like it, and that's fine too. Let's face it, that's half of our personal technology is invested in that way. So I've got a couple of practical examples just to get you into the mindset of thinking about how we attribute value to different sorts of technologies. And so these are ones that we're either using in our business, or we're looking at how we can get them more frequently used across the Riverine Plains, which is from Wagga, New South Wales down to Murchison in Victoria. So we've got a big cropping patch and mixed enterprises. And so I live half the time in Wagga and half the time in Mulwala, Yarrawonga. I spend a minimum of 5 hours a week, and I've got a Vodafone phone and a Telstra phone. And when I first started at Riverine Plains, I could not get reception between Yarrawonga or Mulwala on any of those devices. And so I've had ZE Rovers in other organisations when I was running on-the-ground sales teams, and found them enormously valuable, particularly when I was making phone calls to people who were on the road so that we could have reception. And so so it creates time for me being able to have reception, but it decreases risk too. We've got a lot of farmers and we've got a lot of staff members working on rural roads and rural businesses that if they're not contactable, it can make it pretty hard to make sure that they're safe and where they need to be. And obviously having connectivity in the paddock and on the road enables a lot of other technology. And so I've done some simple math here. And so often you don't get given figures when you're talking ROI on agritech. There's a lot of good reasons for that. It's often the ROI you're getting is quite personal to how you're using that piece of technology or the business that you're running. And so I've used my very real example here. And so this piece of technology, I've costed out over 3 years. It could probably actually be costed out over 5. It's just that I know that they've got a new model out and I know that I will want that model in 3 years' time. So just being very realistic. So the total cost over 3 years is about $3,000. My minimum time that it allows me to be back online is 5 hours per week, 48 weeks, because obviously I try to take a holiday at some point during the year over 3 years. So that's 720 hours that we get back. I'm an ag innovation consultant. I get billed out at a minimum of $180 an hour, and I always do my ROI calculations, particularly for farmer time, at no less than $180 an hour. If I'm honest, they could be more up to $250 because they are often the CEO of their businesses, and an hour on farm can actually produce a lot more revenue than necessarily that $180 an hour. So if I add that up over 3 years, I've got $129,000 worth of value created in just me being able to spend more time doing my job, which is, close to 4,000% ROI. And so that's a conservative figure on the minimum amount of time. And so when you're thinking about that investment, that's a no-brainer. And I've purchased no less than 10 of those ZE Rovers over the last 2 years, and would recommend them to anyone. They've got a lot of cool new products, which obviously I'll be justifying at any given point to strap onto our vehicles. I'm going to do another. This is a much higher value investment. So the more expensive it gets, the higher the ROI sometimes needs to be, but it's all in relative terms. And so earlier this year, I was out in WA. We've been following Swarm Farm for years and years. They've been spending a lot of time on validating and making sure that their products work really well, that they're dependable. They've created a really good business model that works for farm businesses. And so it was great to be out at Brad Jones's in WA. He's got a big patch over there. A lot of big fields, and so I will put the caveat on that. And so we're obviously looking at different farm designs when it comes to this sort of technology. But speaking to Brad, who's in a place where it's about 2 hours from Perth, finding staff's not always that easy, and he's also a farmer that likes to throw a lot of different inputs and trial different inputs in different settings. And so we all know that anytime you've got that, it actually takes a lot of time. And so taking that human or that workforce element out of a lot of those new activities is a really big consideration out there. He's also got a lot of his team now that are learning to code and work with agritech, and it's enormously increased their job satisfaction, being able to upskill and use new technologies and not just have to sit on spraying rigs all the time. And so chatting to Brad, and these are numbers from the farmer, not numbers from Andrew and the Swarm Farm team, but I'm sure they'll have great numbers and use cases for you. Just in case you're interested, the closest swarm farm bot is now on the CSU digital farm, and so we will see a lot more of these numbers cut for our farm designs down here, and so that's exciting. And so the point that we have looked at here is just creating time. And so there's a lot of different other points of, how do you value, retaining staff, or actually be able to put new inputs that could actually increase your yield per hectare. So there's a lot of other points of value, but I've just focused on created capacity. And so we're looking at about a $300,000 piece of equipment here. And so you're calculating that on about a 6-year sort of depreciation rate, or when you might turn over that piece of equipment. Brad is saving about 800 hours a year on that piece of equipment. And so when you're looking at that 800 hours over 6 years at 180, you've got $864,000 worth of value there, which is a 288% return on investment. And so that is just on capacity alone. Imagine if I was bringing to Brad, a cool new foliar or something that could give him a 10% yield increase. But he says, Pip, you've got to be kidding. It takes 3 passes to get the result of that, then plus the man hours that I would need to have to put into that, it's just not going to be viable. And so you think about, how you could enable other ROI across your business by just removing some of the other barriers to adopting them. And so I've done a little bit of a tech stack, because the funnest thing about technology is when you start putting it all together. And so I've used here, I used to work at a biologicals company. They take an enormous amount of effort to validate biologicals and get your technical pack up enough that you can actually start crunching your numbers on ROI. But these numbers were taken off a big corporate farm that we were trialling on up north. And so they are actually real numbers on here. And so we use a biological input to increase soil carbon, which was the only viable way for that corporate farm to go into a carbon project. And so you've got 2 dependencies there, but the biological actually got them 10% yield increase when we were in the first couple of years of using it. And then we've got, say, something like a weather station on there. And so weather stations are interesting because they're largely about decreasing risk, but we can actually use weather data to increase a lot of value. And so Riverine Plains, we've got a weather station network. Feeding our weather data to someone like Jane Bunn, who can actually model it properly and give that information back to farmers, that could actually save them a massive amount of crop loss or give them a lot of opportunity in any given year. And so I've modelled the production risk there. Say it saved you crop loss of $200,000 once every 10 years. And so that's probably a really critical point there. Don't ever model your ROI on 1 year, especially in broadacre. It's got to be a minimum of 5 years, because we're looking at full rotations and aggregated time on investment. But so looking at, we're all about soil carbon in this scenario, and so our soils have gotten a lot more efficient. And so, you sit down with your agronomist, you're getting a lot more value out of your N. You might be trying other things in your systems that might be benefiting from increased water holding capacity or increased nutritional uptake. And so when you stack all of these things up, we're looking at a $400 a hectare increase, and it's not going to be overnight, but it will probably take a couple of years to adopt all of those sort of technologies and getting it working well. But that's just sort of where we're seeing the right technologies that have been validated for the right systems actually paying dividends and making a lot more profit for our farmers, but also making their jobs a lot easier often. So these are technologies that are out and about. Where it's really hard is that validation piece. So it's taken 5 years of data to be able to cut some of those numbers there for a really new biological, and they're only just commercial. And had to work with a lot of different farmers and agronomists to be able to, and scientists to be able to even get close to those numbers. But we're going to have a chat now about a piece of technology like AgScent that's relatively new out on the market, but can have a lot of potential, but in different ways that might not be obvious to farmers right now because they're not using the technologies necessarily in their systems yet where they're going to get the ROI from AgScent. But Darren will probably have hundreds of conversations over the next few years until that's more widely adopted on farms. So Darren, do you want to tell us a bit about AgScent?
Sure. So AgScent was formed in 2018. We began the business looking at or for a non-invasive pregnancy testing system, which we've now developed. And it's basically we've mapped molecules in the breath of animals, or particularly cows in our first instance, that identify pregnancy. We've used some pretty high-tech sensors that we've developed in collaboration with NASA in the United States, and now we're able to detect pregnancy of livestock through their breath. We also have a greenhouse gas monitor as well, principally measuring CO2 and methane, which we've also got on display here today. So they're the two base technologies that we have as a business. The greenhouse gas stuff is commercial now, so we have standalone unit and we have a unit that will integrate into an Optiway system, which is out here in the yard, so a great partnership with Optiway. And we are going to commercialise the pregnancy early next year, around March next year. So that's AgScent's offering at this stage. We will move further down the line into disease. We've done some early work on BRD and other diseases in livestock as well, which will come out of the breath technology too. I guess, from a greenhouse gas perspective, methane's recognised as an energy loss, up to sort of 12% energy loss, which can represent sort of 55, 60 days of grazing time in livestock enterprises. So, by identifying heavy emitters, and removing them from your system and having, that the lower emitting animals, therefore the more productive in your system, represents an immediate ROI. We know that methane is also genetically traceable, it's highly heritable. So again, selection of animals at a stud or seed stock level using some measurement tools will enable, a better genetic throughput into the industry. I guess the other aspect of what we offer with our tool around measuring methane is that a lot of talk around methane inhibitor products. So our tool allows you to potentially look at what you're using in that space and make a decision as to whether or not that's a viable option for you and how it interacts with your herds. We've been a great believer in stacking technologies as well, and again the greenhouse gas sensors stack with the Optiway. It gives you an option to look at the outputs of your animals in your environment on your crops or pastures. So it's not in a chamber, it's not in a research setting necessarily. We do that as well, and we have done all of that validation work in the research space, so we know and are confident in our sensors. But if I'm going to spend $1 a day on a methane inhibitor, I want to know it's going to work, and I need to test that in my environment in the paddock.
And so when I first worked into the Agtech alley over there, I've seen the great work that Optiway's done over the years. Very strong ROI from Bill and the team in terms of the equipment that they have out in paddock. But seeing the AgScent and Optiway collaboration suddenly gave us a new avenue to be able to actually validate a lot of those methane inhibitors. Farmers are facing a lot of pressure at the moment. 14% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. About 12% of those are from enteric methane. And so farmers, I'm sure, are sick of hearing about it without being able to give many options that are actually being validated at paddock scale. And so enteric methane inhibitors, and that's you've probably heard a lot about Asparagopsis and the seaweed in the feed. That sort of technology has been worked on since 2001. It is enormously hard to validate in a commercial farm setting. And so seeing technology like this, it's not only just the ROI that we're getting from a research organisation of the technology. But the quicker we can validate those different feed supplements, and we're doing our first enteric methane trial with a commercial product in sheep coming up. It's a collaboration with Uni of Melbourne. But of course, what our team's wondering is how are we going to make this relevant to a farmer? How are we actually going to get the data that they need to pay this $1 a day for this enteric methane inhibitor to be able to be worth that investment? And so we're actually using this Agtech to enable the adoption of, we're talking $1 billion scale Agtech in terms of the impact on the livestock industry, and particularly agriculture's role in actually being a solution towards greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, which has got immeasurable value. And so when you're thinking about the enablement piece and how farmers can use Agtech to see other value, it just really opens up to see, when we're walking around somewhere like Henty, there's a lot of products on sale and you can't buy everything, and you don't want to go too crazy on your capital investments, especially your depreciating assets. But understanding different ways to work out those calculations and where it can make your job or role in the agricultural or ecosystem easier, gives you a little bit more confidence to actually, trial out new products or, have a play around on farm.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that, obviously our sensors could be quite expensive. So as a capital cost, no one wants that capital cost. The cost of our sensors will come down. The more development we do, that will happen. So we try to make a very flexible business plan in our situation, so that there's an opportunity to rent or lease sensors, rather than having to buy them outright and create your baseline or understanding of your herd or your flock in relation to methane.
Yeah, and we've seen that work really well with things like weather stations and soil moisture probes. I mentioned that big weather station network. We were working with other farming systems groups in New South Wales DPI. There was about 50 weather stations and soil moisture probes, but of course then the 3G turned over and birds got into some, and so there was a very big maintenance piece on that, and we've actually gone for a lease option, and because you're getting them monitored, and so that actually works out better for us, as managing a private network than it did. But it's great to see that the business models there are having that lease or capital investment with the purchasing.
Yep. And I think that's the really important thing. But the important thing is understanding the value of understanding your herd, your flock in your situation. We're quite open and able to put our systems into any livestock feeding system, whether it be feedlot, whether it's paddock, dairies. We do a lot of work in the US around all of this. I guess the underlying thing that we're all considering is how this affects us from a compliance perspective. We believe it's coming. It's not here yet, obviously. Certainly our understanding of the North American market and Europe, there's certain suppliers that won't pick up, buyers of meat that won't pick up your product unless you are able to map these things. So this is an opportunity to start understanding your herd at an early stage.
Great. Cider.
Thank you. It was very interesting. And how do I get my product, where do I get the profit after I measure my methane emissions?
Yeah.
How do I make the profit?
So Cyrus from the audience has just asked a question around using the AgScent product. Where does the point of return of investment or profit come from for measuring the methane emissions on farm?
Yeah, and so it's really identifying the heavy emitters, removing them and reduce. So you're reducing your input cost because they take longer to get to an end product because they're wasting energy. So if you are able to remove those from your herd or flock and have more productive animals, that's one way of creating a return immediately. Not at this stage.
Well,
but you're just getting a fundamental return from more productive animals.
yeah, and so obviously I've worked a lot in carbon markets in my career, and I could actually probably monetize that in terms of a carbon unit, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. It could be a very strong provenance story at this point in, the greenhouse gas emission conversation for farmers. And so, there's a lot of different ways that you could actually monetize that for a farmer, just depending on what their goals are. If we're working on breeding programs and things like that, there's a totally different outcome, and supplying their supply chain with that sort of information could actually make their livestock a lot more valuable and profitable for their breeding programs. So I think and this is why people are very reluctant to give you ROI numbers, because you get a lot of it depends out there in products and things like that. I hate an it depends. I'm an agro's worst nightmare. I'm like, no, give it to me in numbers exactly every year. But it does depend, but it's just understanding, going back to those points of value, that one piece of technology can be monetized through save money, make money. There's a few farmers' faces that I can see here, and compliance keeps coming up with our farmer members. I would have to say our farmers are willing to invest in new technologies just so they have to spend less time in compliance and admin. That's not what a lot of our farmers enjoy about their jobs. I don't think it's anything that any of us enjoy about our jobs, but it might actually just being able to make all of this data collection and compliance easier so people can get back to the business of farming. But thanks again to New South Wales DPI and Farms of the Future.